This is the My Campaign Coach podcast, where we talk about how to win elections. Every week, we let you hear straight from the best consultants, operatives, and candidates in the game, all for one reason: to help you win. For more information about how we can help you win, visit mycampaigncoach.com. Now, here's your host, Raj Schaefer.
Welcome to the How to Run for Office podcast from My Campaign Coach. Thank you to Campaign Sidekick for supporting this podcast. You can visit campaignsidekick.vote to find out how their best-in-breed voter contact platform can revolutionize your campaign and help you win. I want to give a special shout-out to all of the Campaign Sidekick clients that won last week in the primaries across the country and the runoffs here in Texas. Had a bunch of great people using Sidekick to great effect and pulling off victories, so congratulations to all of you guys. This week, we're bringing back onto the podcast one of our very first guests, Brendan Steinhauser. You can check out episode 4 of this podcast to hear us talk about his background and how he runs data-focused campaigns. Those skills are critical to winning the race that we're talking about today. Just a few episodes ago, we talked with Dan Crenshaw. He's a retired lieutenant commander from the Navy SEALs, and he was in a runoff election for the U.S. Congress down in Houston, Texas. He took second place in the original primary by less than 200 votes, beating out a woman who had self-funded millions of dollars into her race. Dan and his team did an incredible job, and Brendan helped quarterback much of that as the general consultant on the race. Last week, they won the runoff, and now they're headed towards the general election in November. If you haven't listened to Dan's interview yet, go back and do so. We cover some of the same ground, but obviously now we know the results, which is pretty great. Getting the same story from both of their perspectives of candidate and consultant is pretty neat, and I really appreciate those guys sharing their stories with us today. Without further ado, let's get to the interview with Brendan. Brendan, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you, and we're excited to hear about how you guys kicked some butt last week.
Well, thank you for having me, and we're still recovering, but we're still celebrating too. No
doubt. That was huge. I mean, not only did you guys were able to help Dan Crenshaw, who we just had on a few weeks back, come as and never having run for office before and win or get a seat in the runoff, overcoming Kathleen Wall, who had self-funded millions of dollars. But in the runoff, you came back and had the biggest, I believe, runoff margin of victory of any Republican candidate in the state, which is huge. Talk to us a little about, let's go back a little bit to, when you were first working with Dan, and let's move forward from there. He told us a little bit about the campaign and kind of his beginnings, but would love to get your perspective on the entire thing.
Sure. No, that sounds good. And yeah, looking back, which isn't actually that long ago, it's kind of interesting and exciting to see how far we've come since one. Dan and I were connected through a mutual friend and a political savant of ours that said, hey, you guys need to get connected. Dan's looking at running for Congress. Brendan's there in Texas, can help you out. You guys just need to connect and have a conversation. So Dan was considering it. He was back home in Houston after being in the SEAL teams for 10 years and going on to get his master's degree at Harvard and doing some work on Capitol Hill. So he was kind of in a post-Harvey world trying to figure out if this was the right opportunity with Congressman Poe retiring. And we talked about it, and I said, you've got a great story to tell. You've got a great background in service and leadership. The question is just, can we reach the voters in the short time that we have with the limited resources that we have? Can we build a campaign effectively, efficiently, cheaply to be able to compete on March 6th? We are going up against some folks who are going to put hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars into these races. So that's the question. And then secondly, what if you don't win? What do you have to lose? We kind of talked about that, and he said, well, I hate to lose, but I plan on winning. But certainly I've been through a lot worse than losing an election. And so that really kind of made me happy as a consultant to hear that, he wanted to win. He was going to fight to do it, but he understood that, often in campaigns, it can take one or two runs until you actually can get into office. And so I really kind of liked how he started, just from that kind of clean slate. And, Dan told me, he said, I don't have really a lot of political connections. I've been in the military my whole life. And, I just haven't been making those connections. I haven't been there thinking about running for office for years. So I want some help with that and just sort of getting started in what we need to do. So we really just kind of laid out a plan that was very reasonable, that was very doable. And we said, okay, here's how much money we think we need just to be able to get things off the ground. Here are the kinds of things that we need to do. Here are the things we need from you. So we just started relationship and that conversation, and just day in and day out through the weeks ahead, we just took those steps. And I knew that he had a strong brand. Again, a SEAL who's wounded in Afghanistan, lost his right eye, who then redeployed 5 times for his country. I knew that the image of Dan Crenshaw, the story of Dan Crenshaw, was powerful. Had to get it in front of those voters in the short amount of time that we had. And we kind of had an idea of about how many people would show up in that first round of balloting on March 6th. And so we started to sort of do our targeting from that. And a lot of people thought we were crazy. We didn't run a single TV ad. We spent, a few dollars on radio here and there, but we really focused on the digital marketing and on grassroots. That's where we put most of our resources. And from my perspective, that's how we had to do it in order to win.
Mm-hmm. Well, a couple of the things stood out from your comments and talking to Dan a few weeks ago was one that, he said, I had one political contact when this all started, which was you. And that's a pretty remarkable testament to your friendship, what you brought to the table as a consultant, that you could help make that happen. But it's also a reflection of the power of his story and that brand you discussed. That's critically important. And it can cut both ways, but in this case, it seems like it was really nice to have a candidate who was kind of a fresh slate. He didn't have a whole lot of preconceived notions as far as what was going to be his ticket. He was willing to listen to you and let you come to him with a plan. He's been in the leadership in the SEAL teams. He knows about delegation and saying, okay, I want the guy that's best equipped to build me out a plan here. I want them to make the plan. We'll talk about it and we'll put it in the field. And you took that and you said, hey, we got Kevin Roberts and Kathleen Wall as our primary competition. That we're going up against a lot of money, a lot of name ID. How do we find an asymmetric strategy to go out and win this thing? And you nailed it. 100%. With grassroots and digital, you just crushed that and did an awesome job. Now, through there, you were coming. One of the remarkable things about your runoff or the March 6th victory was how you guys surged and how perfectly you were able to peak at just the right moment. How did that happen? I know you guys did the 100-mile run and stuff to do earned media, but what were some of the major factors that went into making sure you could actually peak there and pull off a very, very narrow movement to get the spot in the runoff?
Well, thanks for that question, and thank you for the compliment. I think it's right that you have to have a really good candidate to be able to pull something like this off. I don't think we could have done that with just anybody. Dan Crenshaw is certainly in a category of his own as a candidate in terms of his story, his work ethic, his smarts. He was just such a fast learner and a policy guy too. And that's what I like about him as well. We had a lot of good conversations about the importance of entitlement reform and, tax reform and those things. We really got in the weeds on some of that just kind of as we started to think about what his positions would be and where he came down on the issues. But yeah, I think that, one of the things about this first round of balloting was that we knew we didn't have a lot of resources. We knew we didn't have a lot of time and that we would eventually get there. We just had to be very efficient with our time and with our money. And so we really focused on fundraising and holding those dollars pretty tightly until right before early voting started. We did a lot of earned media. We did a lot of pitching to, district, state, and national media contacts. We were able to get them on Fox News a couple of times. We then took those clips and we marketed those clips on Facebook in particular. And it kind of helped with a mix of an organic and a paid effort online to just get in front of a lot of influential people in the district. And then, of course, he made lots of calls to precinct chairs, to Republican delegates who had gone to the conventions. He worked on the local Republican club circuit and just slowly built that snowball effect, both online and then offline on the ground to just reach people one at a time. And it really did take on a viral nature. You had advocates who would become supportive of Dan, then they would go out and put out, 20 or 30 yard signs in their neighborhood. They'd knock on doors for him, make calls for him, post on social media. So we kind of saw this momentum potential building really day one. It was small back then, but we did reach a tipping point right before early voting. And part of that was because we had the run scheduled and lined up to go, which was actually Dan's idea. It was executed very well. No surprise coming from a SEAL.
Right.
But
they
also,
can run.
Absolutely. I thought he was crazy at first. I said, 100 miles. Can you actually physically do that? He's like, I can do it.
He's like, how about a Tuesday?
Yeah, exactly. So I was just like, hey, if you can do that, that's going to be fantastic. And, we'll support you through every effort we can on, the social media side and earned media. So we did the run, but we also really held our expenditure on, social media and radio and things like that, in the mail as well. Until we were right before early voting. We sort of all had it happen at once because we knew there was already natural momentum, but we also kind of fed the momentum, right, by doing our expenditures at the time, by targeting specifically the voters in the district as well. TV ads and radio ads do have a place in politics, especially in big statewide races, national races. But when you're dealing with a district that is so, gerrymandered as they mostly are, and sort of doesn't make a whole lot of sense geographically, you really are not spending those dollars as effectively as you could in other ways. So we knew that, sure, we'll do some earned media and that'll help, and we'll do some radio at that time. But man, we really focused on direct voter contact, targeting individual voters who had a propensity to vote based on their past voting histories. And so all of this was sort of happening at the same time. We were doing lots of phone calls out as well to voters, and we started to see the numbers really rise. He was about at 10 or 12% saying they supported him kind of at the beginning of the run. But by that weekend before the weekend before the election, as early voting ended, we were seeing numbers of about 30% support. And he ended up with right at that 27% mark. So we really saw it in the phone calls and in the door knocks that we did. And it was just at the right time.
So were you guys doing tracking polling and stuff that was informing your efforts there at the end, or was that largely information you got from the direct voter contact?
It was absolutely the latter. In fact, we did no polling throughout the campaign, which, again, shocked a lot of people and frightened a lot of people. But, we were literally talking to so many voters every day at the doors, on the phones, online. We were getting so much. We had the kind of numbers that gave us the confidence that what we were seeing was accurate, and that a poll is certainly helpful into snapshot into a segment of the voters, and you're trying to predict who's actually going to show up. But we knew that no matter who showed up, that we were going to do well, because pretty much the entire universe of voters at that point had, there was a strong support for Dan, especially in the runoff election, which we'll get to. I think by that point we knew that no matter who showed up, that we would do well. So yeah, a lot of this information was just coming from the ground. It was coming from the calls, the door knocks. It was coming from people sharing information with us, being out in the field, and there was no real deviation. It was all consistent. About the same amount of people, whether you looked at the phones, the doors, online, about the same percentage of people were saying that they would vote for Dan.
So this is kind of an in-the-weeds question, but one of the things I've seen in the past running large-scale ground efforts, especially at the door, is I typically find there's some kind of number of false positives as far as people that'll say they'll support or something like that. And so I had one candidate, state rep, that I was working for a couple years ago, and we had numbers that were around 55 or so support, and we had a pretty good number of undecideds, only a few for saying no, they're supporting his opponent. And while he was excited about that, I had to tell him, hey, look, this does not mean that's a hard 55. You're somewhere, you're probably within 5 or 10 points of that, so you're close. But there are some of these people that are lying to you. Did you guys see that in your race when you're looking at those numbers, kind of using them as a tracking poll, or how did you guys deal with that?
No, it's a good question. In fact, when we started to see his support rise during that first round of balloting, and it did hit about that high 20s, low 30s support, I kind of said to him and to the team, either folks are starting to tell us what they want us to hear, or what we want to hear, or they're lying to us, or it's true, and we have this kind of momentum. And so we were always cautious about what that meant, and I always kind of added that grain of salt. But because the numbers were consistent across media, because the anecdotes matched up with the data, because there was no evidence of anything else, undercutting that argument, we just kind of felt confident that we were within that range. Now, of course, in the first round of balloting, we only won by 155 votes, or we finished actually second place, beating Kathleen Wall by 155 votes. So it was a lot closer. But by the runoff election during that race, we just kept building momentum. We never saw it go down. And, every day the volunteers would come back and tell the team, the folks we're talking to are saying 5-1, 6-1, Dan Crenshaw. We knew targeting some of those pro-Dan areas, but just never saw a lot of Roberts supporters out there. And then there was also the false positive effect for Roberts. We actually had, folks who were kind of secretly telling us, hey, I've voted for him in the first round, and I've got a yard sign in my yard. I'm probably going to vote for Dan in this runoff. So we started to see that kind of stuff happen.
Nice.
Well.
Well, I tell you what, there are a few races that I look at that fundamentally change something about how I view campaigns, and I got to tell you that this one at least put an asterisk next to one of those in my kind of internal campaign playbook, and that's that I am typically one of the most dubious about the effect of yard signs. But the asterisk now in my mental playbook is that if you have your picture on the yard sign and you wear an eye patch, you look like a pirate running for Congress, then yard signs are great.
Absolutely. Well, and what's so funny about that too is, that was his idea. He and his wife and their friend kind of like, hey, what do you think, Brendan, about putting his face on the yard sign? And I said, man, I don't know of many people that do that. Some will do it and it doesn't look good. They'll have a color photo, that sort of thing. But then when he had the iconic image that someone created and it looked good, I said, hey, that's actually going to stand out quite a bit. And it'll remind a lot of voters, oh, yeah, that's the guy. That's the SEAL that lost his eye in Afghanistan. And it'll remind them of your name. And the other thing about yard signs that I really see is that if you have a candidate that doesn't have a lot of name ID in the district, that's trying to build that ID, and you also have the signs in the yards of people who have influence within the community. If it's precinct chairs and delegates to convention and people that run Republican clubs or Tea Party groups, I think those do have a little bit more influence than if it's just kind of randomly out there on the streets. But yeah, and again, a lot of that effort was just so organic. People were just kicking down the door to get materials, to get signs and door hangers. And as you know, on a campaign, when that's happening, that you're going to have a shot and that you potentially could do really well.
Yeah, and I think for that yard sign, the cool thing about it that I rarely see is that it made you want to learn more. I mean, if you didn't know Dan's story already, then you're like, okay, why the hell is a pirate run for Congress? And you're like, okay, I gotta look more into this Dan Crenshaw guy. Why is he walking around wearing an eye patch? He looks like a cool dude, got a good beard. I want to learn more. And I would imagine that you guys received a lot of organic traffic and search traffic from folks being like, okay, who is this guy? What's his story? And once they found that out, you had them hooked. They were compelled by the power of his story and by his leadership background and sacrifice, and that's a story that's hard to find.
Absolutely, and the same with the T-shirts and things like that had his face on them, and we kind of created a store and put it out there, and oftentimes the campaigns, the T-shirts are kind of boring, and people only the paid people or volunteers that are hardcore will wear them, but the cool factor did kick in. People liked to get the T-shirt and started to get them online in big numbers, and so it just kind of created this effect that is hard to manufacture in politics, right? It has to be organic, it has to be real, but you have to be able to feed it and to encourage it and to make sure that people have the resources to go out there and that image and that message. And then, the other thing we used in a big way, I thought successfully, was Facebook Live. And I know a lot of candidates and a lot of nonprofits and organizations kind of use that as a tool. But I found that to be very powerful, whether it was Dan's speeches, whether it was the run itself through the district, or just him giving updates on the campaign. It allowed people to get to know Dan and his wife, Tara, and his dad, Jim, and his stepmom, Carmen. It really allowed people to get to know his family, and they got those direct updates from Dan, which is the most powerful thing you can do on a campaign, is directly connect the candidate to the voters.
Yeah, sometimes you have candidates you don't really want to have that access to the voters, but in Dan's case, he was just so good and so comfortable in front of the camera and talking with people, just a very relaxed, very genuine guy, that it was a medium that really crushed it for him. And on the run videos, I was watching those that are coming across live. It was always fun seeing him running down the street with the Humvee and everything and convoy behind him.
Yeah, no, it was a lot of fun to watch that on Facebook and kind of push it out there and see the comments and the shares and just the engagement on that. And again, a lot of that stuff was organic. Folks wanted to chip in, they wanted to help out, and I kind of joked with them the other day. It took on a Forrest Gump appeal, and
right.
There was a great and Dan can tell the story better than I can, but he was given an American flag that apparently that someone found like in the trash can. Like some person had thrown this flag away, and this guy came up and he gave it to Dan. He's like, I want you to carry this flag. The flag deserves you, and you deserve the flag because you are a true patriot. And it was a really incredible kind of moment, and just to watch him carry that flag as he ran was just a great. It was a man, who'd been through a lot in his life on a mission, and he knew that this wasn't the most important mission he'd ever do. And I'm sure that on the run he thought a lot about friends of his that he lost, and it was really kind of probably a cathartic moment for him, and it turned out to be really great as far as the campaign goes.
That's beautiful. So moving forward from the runoff, I mean, you guys just barely beat Kathleen. You got 100 and some votes over her. Surprised a lot of people. I was hopeful, but I mean, when you got an opponent that puts close to $6 million into their own race, that's tough to beat. When they got their own Super Bowl ads and stuff, that's pretty impressive. And not a whole lot of people saw you guys coming, but you sneak by them. You surprised a lot of people. Then I'm interested to find out the impact of the Jocko podcast here, because obviously big fan of podcasts, and I've been listening to Jocko since he first came on with this podcast. Got hundreds of thousands of downloads on a weekly basis. One of the top podcasts out there. And Jocko, for those of you guys who don't know, he was a task force commander in the SEAL teams, so a brother of Dan's, and he's had this podcast focused on leadership and specifically military leadership for a long time. And he's stayed away from anything political up until Dan made the runoff, and then he had Dan like the week after on the podcast and let Dan share his story. He was talking with him for a couple-hour interview, and then you made a direct pitch asking folks to support. I'm just interested kind of a little bit about how that helped, because I'm wondering how podcasts and especially some of these bigger ones may impact campaigns down the line.
Yeah, no, it definitely helped, and we did see donations coming in, and every time Dan did something like that, there was money that was coming in. People saying, I heard him on the podcast, or I saw him on TV, or I heard him on Hugh Hewitt's radio show, I want to give money. And people contacted us on the website, they contacted us on Facebook, they really found him, sought him out. So it definitely made a huge impact, and it also encouraged other folks to take a look at Dan, and encouraged people around the country who were just wanting to help out a fellow veteran in many cases. The veteran community in this country really chipped in for Dan in terms of support and financial resources and opening doors and just doing favors for him, introducing him to people both in Houston and in the media world, around the country. So it was a huge help, and all of that kind of earned media, especially taking it more to a local level with Michael Berry coming in and talking about Dan and being critical of his opponent for the negative campaign that he ran, talking about the slates. That had a huge impact in the race. So all of that kind of not paid for but earned media made a huge impact in the race. And we were able to harness that. We were set up now by the runoff to actually be able to take in that incoming and turn it into votes. In the first round, we were just kind of like a startup, getting started. We didn't have a campaign office. We had a very limited staff, and we sort of ran a very, very efficient, cheap campaign in the first round. Then we were able to bring on some more professional fundraisers. We were able to bring on a really talented campaign manager who had lots of experience over the years, and she was phenomenal, kind of helping us become a well-oiled machine. We hired some great kind of grassroots hands who divided the district up into kind of Northeast and Southwest and took that on. So we really just professionalized everything, but Dan was still Dan. He didn't change his message or who he was or why he was running. And I think that really showed throughout the entire campaign.
You mentioned slates and the negative campaigning. I know those both factored heavily into what you guys had to compete against, especially during the runoff, once you became a real target. Talk a little bit about both of those and how y'all dealt with them, because I think that's something that more and more candidates are having to deal with.
Sure. Yeah, slates have been around Harris County politics for some time. They've had a lot of influence, frankly, over the years. They've also created some blowback by just the idea of being paid to play, and also the fact that they'll, go after candidates in a kind of a very negative, nasty way. And so, at the very beginning, we knew they would be a factor. We knew that they would also focus heavily on direct mail because that's their business model. That's what they do. And so we knew that was probably the case, and that we would fight an uphill battle kind of with the vote by mail folks, especially in the first round, just given we didn't have time on our side. But by the second round in the runoff, part of our strategy was actually to get to the mail early and often to compete with the folks that vote by mail, to turn some of the Roberts supporters and Wall supporters toward us. We were hoping to get between 48 to 50% of the vote by mail in the runoff. We ended up getting 54% or so. So that was a big win. And of course, when we saw that number, we knew we were going to do really well. But there's been a big backlash against the slates in Harris County. We'll see that fight kind of continue. But people just want to make up their own minds, and they want to feel like there's not a corrupt political establishment, as Dan termed it in his victory speech that night. That's sort of controlling the strings, and Dan really did play a big role in smashing the power of the slates. But they're not going to give up or go away. They're going to still continue to have influence.
But what are those? Just give people a little more background about what those are and why folks care about them.
Well, I would argue that the reason they matter is because they have the financial resources and the lists of voters to get to communicate with voters directly in the mail, especially voters that tend to vote by mail, that tend to read the slates, that listen to what they have to say. And it's essentially just a list of candidates that they've endorsed. But they typically endorse the candidates that, give the most money or who give them money at all. So we really had a policy of not offering any funds for any slates. We were going to, certainly we would accept any endorsement from anywhere, but we weren't going to even have a conversation about paying people for the slate. So I think that actually helped us. And I think that when they did go really negative, and it went kind of beyond the pale in terms of attacks against Dan, I think that's when actually a lot of Roberts supporters started to peel away from him and said, we don't like the campaign that you and your folks are running and your supporters are running, and we're going to vote for Dan partially because of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, they were calling him everything from homeless to unemployed, all this garbage, and basically decrying his military service and trying to ignore that or downplay it. And you just take a quick look at the guy's background, and you saw that the type of lies. They found out on election day, on the runoff day, how poorly people responded to those kinds of negative attacks.
Absolutely. It was a huge strategic blunder, and I don't know that Kevin Roberts would have won in the runoff anyway. If he would have run a very kind of positive, clean campaign, and just embraced Dan and just sort of said nice things about him, I don't know if that would have led to victory for him, for Roberts. But I certainly think that it helped our margin of victory that they went so negative. And I think from our perspective, our team, as well as Dan's candidate, were having these conversations about how to respond. And we always stuck to the fact of, Dan needs to run a positive campaign. He's not a typical politician. He's not going to participate in that. We didn't want him to punch down, and we knew that we were going to win, and we did not feel the need to do it, and we knew that we would be rewarded by the voters. In fact, we trusted the voters to do the right thing, which would be not to reward that type of. So from a strategic decision-making, I think that was one of the strategic decisions made in the runoff that was right, which was, let's stay positive. Dan is the Boy Scout in this race, and if he maintains that image and that reality of who he is, we trust the vote to make the right decision. And in the end, they did, and overwhelmingly by 40 points. Yeah,
that was incredible. I mean, statewide, we had a bunch of different runoffs in all these open seats, and most of them were within 3 to 5 points. Y'all's race, what was the point margin on that?
It was 40 points. We got just 70% to 30%.
Which is just insane, by the way. I mean, that's truly just crushed that campaign. Y'all did awesome.
Well, thank you. And we really kind of went back and forth on, okay, how many people are going to show up in this runoff? It's typically about half, but given the energy and excitement and enthusiasm for Dan out there, we thought we could push those numbers up. And we ended up with about 29,000 people showing up in the runoff. About 48,000 showed up in the first round. So well over 50% is what we kind of expected. And it was really interesting on election. We were starting to see just the vote totals in the areas where Dan was strong and where he was, and where Roberts was strong, right, in his kind of area. And it was kind of interesting because we front-loaded a lot of early votes, and we thought, okay, what's going to happen on election day? Is the margin going to be closer or the same or farther apart? And we kind of internally discussed this and thought about it. And I made this comment. I said, I kind of wonder if what we're seeing with this higher turnout in Robert's natural area, if that's not due to actually Dan boosting turnout. And it's not necessarily Robert supporters, it's Dan supporters who are coming out and actually, and are voting for him. And if that's going to keep the margin where it is. And in fact, on election day, he ended up doing even better than he did in early voting. So he got 2/3 of the vote, 67% in early voting. And he got like 75% on election day, which is incredible.
Wow. That is truly amazing. Man. So, one of the things we talked about in our first conversation after I found out you were running Dan's campaign is the importance of, as you have a new guy that's going to Congress, hasn't been in elected office before, is the importance of surrounding himself, and your role as a consultant, helping surround him with good conservatives and making sure that just helping identify the true friends and those who just want to glom on, either co-opt him or use him as a prop, especially as a former SEAL and someone who's wounded in the line of duty. That's something that there's plenty of people who would love to use him as a prop for their own political careers. How did you go through that side of your consulting duties and mentorship politically of him, and how should other people approach that same type of question?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, this is something I care a lot about, and it's something that I focused a lot on during the campaign. I wanted to get to know Dan in policy positions, his views on just sort of what's going on in our country and around the world. And we just had a lot of lengthy conversations at the beginning, but also as the campaign went on about where he stood on the issues. And, there were certainly some cases where we kind of discussed or debated back and forth on the one hand, on the other hand, with kind of getting into the weeds in some of these positions. But overall, we knew we shared values, and we knew that there was very little room for disagreement, or that really there was no daylight between most of us on the policy positions. But, he was very thoughtful, and he always listened to everything and everybody on these things, but he did have good instincts. But we would kind of talk about some of these policies, and I would certainly buttress my arguments with political arguments as well, and say, look, not only is this good policy, this is good politics. This is where the voters are. Here's the data, and it was kind of funny because he certainly was more interested in policy than in the politics of it, which I also expect. But we did sat down and talked about stuff. We obviously connected him with folks at the Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, and other think tanks and conservative outfits in Texas and around the country. We sent him briefing materials and books to read and all this sort of stuff. And he, of course, was his own greatest policy mind. He wrote most of his own stuff. If you go to our website, you'll see his positions there. He wrote that stuff on flood control, on national security, on healthcare, entitlement reform, you name it. And I will say, too, one of the things I was really excited about was when he was willing to be bold and talk about entitlement reform. Like, one of the big issues that nobody talks about because they're afraid of this third rail, Social Security. And he went out there and talked about it, and he got attacked on it, and it didn't work. And so for me, that's really exciting, right? To have a candidate who says, I want to talk about big, bold reforms. I want to do term limits. I want to do fundamental tax reform, entitlement reform. I want to have a very strict border security policy. I want to be 100% pro-law. All of these things that came up, he showed not only can you win, but you can win big, certainly in a Republican primary. I also think we'll show in the general that when we layer on top of that his conservative credentials with the fact that he's fluent in Spanish, he's 34 years old, has lived all over the world, he's a veteran, those are things that are going to help him in the general election as well. And I'm very excited about stealing some votes from our opponent in the fall.
Yeah, so looking forward to the fall. Even though that's been a reliable Republican seat for quite a while with Ted Poe, this is, all bets are off when it comes to an open seat, and as far as, when we're looking at nationwide problems, a generic ballot. So you can't take anything for granted, even with a pretty good R seat. How are you guys looking at that? You've obviously got some specific advantages that a lot of Republicans don't have, but give me an idea of how you approach this November race against Democrat with Dan.
Sure. Well, the first thing that we've already kind of talked about is that, we're dealing with more of a national climate. The electorate is going to be focused on national issues, international issues. The motivations by the Democrats and Republicans are very different. A lot of people are going to show up and just sort of vote straight party. That's a big percentage of the vote count. There's not a lot of room in the middle. There's not a lot of true independents anymore that you can go after. A lot of independents actually lean conservative because they're former Republicans. But, you have to kind of start sifting through all that. We need to go and do more and more research on looking back, how many people voted over the years in CD to what have those vote totals look like. There haven't been that many competitive races to really look at. So kind of just examining all of that history, looking, of course, at how President Trump did in 2016. And actually, he won that district by 9 points. But, you have all these factors, and you're trying to predict how many people are going to show up in the fall, how many Republicans and Democrats, how many swing voters, who are they, right? Are these people that are your typical, primary voters plus general election voters? Are there people that have never voted before that will show up because they either want to support President Trump or oppose him? You just kind of have to weigh all that stuff. And that's really where and then I try and figure out, okay, let's get some predictions based on some actual data. Let's get some answers to these questions, or at least some predictions, and then kind of go from there. But from an issue set, I think you have to be true to your base. You have to go out and continue to talk about the things that helps you get the nomination. I think you just need to add a few issues to appeal to folks in the general election, and talk about those issues in addition to what you about in the primary. I think that's really the key. And if you are who you were and you continue to be that person, you're going to more likely carry the day if you, as Dan did so well in the primary.
Well, from everything I can tell, Dan really seems to be one of those rarest of political beasts, which is somebody who actually believes what he says. And I think you share his opinion, but many would think it is naive. I've always believed that if you're able to go out there and are willing to effectively articulate what you believe in, even on when it comes to some of those third rail issues like entitlement reform, if you're willing to step out there and talk to voters, not down to them, but to them in a way that shows that you care and that you're interested in tackling those big issues that they're frustrated with, that they're going to reward that. And I think you guys saw that during the primary and the runoff. And my hope is you'll see it as you move forward to November.
I hope so too. It gives me a lot of hope in kind of our political system and in our party, if folks can support a candidate, continue to support a candidate like Dan Crenshaw, who doesn't just tell you what you want to hear, who may even have debated a few voters here and there on policy questions in a public way, who was not afraid of the YouTube moment that a lot of politicians are afraid of, right? What he said privately on issues is what he said publicly, and it showed. And he's not afraid to have that debate among friends. He's not afraid to have that debate among political adversaries as well. And I think he's looking forward to debating our opponent in the fall. And one of the things he really talks about is taking the conservative message and articulating it effectively and trying to win over independent voters, win over moderates, and even some Democrats. Now, that's a very tall task, but he's willing to go out and carry the torch for us. And I think that, he's kind of made it a point to say, I'm not going to change who I am. I'm a conservative. We're going to take this message to these folks, and we want to persuade them to join us to vote in November. But, a lot of candidates, a lot of consultants don't necessarily take that approach. It's just sort of, let's turn out our base and that's it. But I think Dan's going to go on offense and try and convince some folks who we share some values with, not all values, to come our way and vote for Dan and vote for the Republicans in November.
Well, I think that he's someone that has a unique opportunity to do that, in that he's very comfortable in the mediums that are very effective right now. He's willing to get out there and talk with people and to have those constructive conversations. And I think what comes through most clearly, as I've watched so many of his videos and got to talk with him one-on-one and interview him, is that he knows who he is. He knows what he believes. He's willing to fight for it. And there's nothing scary about politics once you've been blown up, you've been shot at, you've had those experiences. For a lot of people, the political fights that they go into are the scariest thing they've done their entire life. For Dan, that's not even close to being true. And I think there's a comfort in his own skin that he has that a lot of first-time candidates don't, because of that wealth and horrific nature of so many of his experiences.
I think you're absolutely right. You put it so well, and I've kind of heard him and Tara talk about that and just saying we've been through a lot worse than losing an election or having people attack us, or whatever issues. Like it doesn't bother us. We about continuing to serve. This is about taking his leadership skills and really doing service for his district, for the state, and for the country. And it sounds kind of cliche because everybody says that. When you think about who are the kinds of people we want in Washington, the kind of people that we want in Congress, they're guys like Dan and women like Dan, candidates who have those experiences, veterans, people who have actually done something in their life that have actually proven that they care about service, that they've done it. And so I think, we have to win in November, certainly, but just kind of look ahead to the future, into next year. Really excited to see how things look, a year from now, to really see what he's been able to do and the kinds of things that he'll find, that are happening in DC, maybe in the bureaucracy, or maybe things that are dysfunctional, and be able to find solutions and fixes. Because I know that's what's motivating him. It's certainly not just going up there and clinking glasses at the cocktail parties. He really wants to get to work.
Yeah, that came across very clearly. He's the amount that he had clearly studied the different policy issues and his desire to get into the weeds and really explore the pros and cons of different solutions was something that was frankly quite rare, even in congressional candidates, maybe even especially among congressional candidates I've talked to. And he's got a great attitude. I have high hopes and high expectations for him when he gets there, because he'll be getting there at a time when entitlement reform is near the top of President Trump's second half of his first term agenda. Want to get to work on that. Want to make some of these tax cuts permanent and go back for a second bite. Having conservatives who can articulate the positions and the why behind them, how they're going to affect people throughout all classes and of all backgrounds, is going to be important. And conservatives need people like Dan who can go and do that and can pick up those marginal votes, who can articulate why conservative principles are what we need to be guided by.
I think that's exactly right. And obviously he showed on the battlefield, and now I've had him show lots of political courage as well from day one. And so I'm very excited about what you just described, going to DC saying, come on guys, let's go get this done for the country. Let's not be afraid of the political consequences. It's not why we're here. And as my old boss, Dick Armey, used to say, if they're smart enough to vote for you, certainly they're smart enough to understand why you took this vote on this issue. They trusted you. They sent you to DC to do something. So if you can't explain that when you go home, then maybe you should go into another business, because that's what they sent us to do. It's not just to hang out and be a congressman. It's to actually get something done for your constituent, to fight for what we believe.
I like it. So tell us where folks can find out more about you and your consulting business, as well as where folks can go to find out more about Crenshaw.
Sure. Well, folks can come check out our business website at steinhauserstrategies.com. And my personal website is brendansteinhauser.com. I tend to pontificate on my blog from time to time. We also post stories about our clients and just kind of, what we're doing, what we're up to. And then for Crenshaw, you can go find him on Facebook. Pretty easy to find him there. Also at CrenshawForCongress.com. And we have a pretty respected team. So if you want to get in touch with us and want to help, or you have questions about Dan, please just visit us and get in touch with us, and we'll have somebody get right back in touch with you.
Well, and spell Steinhauser for folks that may be spelling challenged.
Sure, it's Steinhauser.
And Steinhauser Strategies, and Brendan Steinhauser, where you can find them online. Brendan, thank you so much for coming back and for sharing some of your victory story. We're excited and very hopeful for an awesome win in November, and look forward to seeing some great things in the meantime.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for your support for Dan.
Oh, it's our pleasure. We expect a lot from you guys, so get to work.
Will do.
Please subscribe and rate us on iTunes to help spread the word. We'll be back with you next week with more campaign insights from my campaign coach.